Welcome to the next video in the A Local Ecosystem series. This video will be looking at 2 dot points, explain trophic interactions between organisms in an ecosystem using food chains, food webs, and pyramids of biomass and energy, and describe the role of decomposers in ecosystems. So we're going to start off with the much bigger dot point of the two, which is explain trophic interactions between organisms in an ecosystem using food chains, food webs, and pyramids of biomass and energy. So we need to be able to identify and explain what a food chain is, also what a food web is, and be able to talk about pyramids of biomass as well as pyramids of energy. So starting off with food chains and food webs. So food chains and food webs are simple diagrams that show the flow of energy in an ecosystem by using either pictures of the organisms or their names and arrows. The arrows in food chains and food webs are drawn from the source of the food to the consumer, and basically the point of the arrows is to show the flow of energy. So we can see here we start with our sunshine, which provides energy for the plant provides energy for the snail, and the snail provides energy for the bird. Now, in our food chains and food webs, we do not have to include the sun because it's a given that the sun provides the initial energy for the food chain or the food web. So as we looked at in the section on photosynthesis, plants are the beginning of all food chains. So they are known as producers or autotrophs as they produce their own food. So through the process of photosynthesis, they use the carbon dioxide from the air, water that they bring up from the roots, the energy from the sun and the chlorophyll in the chloroplast to produce glucose and oxygen. So the glucose becomes their food source. So the term autotroph we can break down into 2 parts. So auto means self and troph means feeding. So producers, or also more scientifically referred to as autotrophs, is what plants are known as. Animals, on the other hand, are known as consumers or heterotrophs, as they need to consume other food sources to meet their energy requirements. So again, dividing our word into 2, hetero means different feeding means that they need to get their food source from a different place. So to meet their energy requirements, they need to either consume plant or animal material. And as we saw in the previous picture, each link in the chain provides energy for the next link. So some animals, which are known as herbivores, eat plants, and these can include things like deer, horses, rabbits, cows, sheep, grasshoppers, and even bees that consume flower material. Then we have animals that eat other animals, which can include insects, felines, so large cats like lions and tigers, birds of prey, including eagles, hawks, sharks, frogs, and spiders. And lastly, those organisms that eat both plant and animal material, which are referred to as omnivores. So humans, we are omnivores as we eat both plant and animal material. Also, most bears would be omnivores as well. Same with monkeys and apes. So they do eat, we do see them, or we're used to them eating a lot of fruit. However, monkeys and apes will eat small insects that they find in amongst the bark of trees. So when we start looking at an ecosystem, there will be more plants than herbivores and more herbivores than carnivores. So the reason for this is because as we move along the food chain, less energy is available in the form of body mass that each link receives. A large amount of the energy that is originally gathered from the sun is lost at each link in the chain in the form of heat. And further along the chain, there's less food and therefore less energy available. So as a result, most food chains have 4 or maybe 5 links. So you wouldn't see anything greater than that, because if there were too many links, the animal at the end would not actually get enough energy to survive, and they would die anyway. So to be able to deal with their energy requirements, most animals are part of more than one food chain, because we know that pretty much every animal that exists eats more than one type of food. So what we do is we have then interconnected food chains that form a food web. Then when we look at food pyramids, that actually then shows us the relationship between the number of organisms and the trophic levels that they're at. So the lowest trophic level is the producers. So remember that word troph means feeding. So feeding level is producers. And they're larger than the next, which are the first order consumers, which are usually our herbivores that eat our plants, which is then larger than the second order consumers, which eat our first order consumers, and so on and so forth. And we get this sort of pyramid effect. We can think of this like a football field. There's obviously a couple thousand blades of grass in a football field. You wouldn't find a couple of thousand insects and a couple of thousand birds eating the grass and then eating the insects. So as we move up, the organisms usually get bigger as well as we move up the order of consumers. So therefore, we don't fit as many of them in the ecosystem. So the following image here shows a basic food chain. The plant is the producer, which we've said multiple times now, gets their energy from the sun. This is converted by the process of photosynthesis into glucose, most of which is used by the plant. However, this is then eaten by the insect, in which this food chain is known as the first order consumer. The insect is then eaten by the mouse, which is in turn eaten by the owl. So these animals become the second and third order consumers respectively. Then if we had something eat the owl, it would become the fourth order, and then something that ate that would be the fifth. But as we said, we usually only have 4, maximum 5 links in our food chains. So this image here shows us a basic food web that incorporates a similar food chain to the one from the previous slide. So in a food web, multiple food chains interact and show that organisms consume or are consumed by more than one other organism. So we can see here our plant is the producer, and then it is eaten by the grasshopper. Now we can see by following the arrows that the grasshopper is actually eaten by 4 different consumers. So we have the spider, the weasel, the shrew, and the hawk. So then we can follow on from there. The shrew is then eaten by the hawk or the weasel or the owl. And so depending on the chain that you follow would depend on whether the hawk is a secondary or a tertiary consumer. So along this chain, grasshopper, spider, hawk, it's tertiary or third order. And if we just go grasshopper to hawk, it would be considered to be a secondary consumer, So what about energy? Energy is lost to the environment mostly in the form of heat at each trophic level. This is why the number of organisms decreases as you move along the food chain or the food web, as there is less and less energy available to sustain the individuals. So our producers get the energy from the sun. It goes into our primary consumer, where part of that energy is lost. And then as we move up, obviously more and more heat is lost, so there's less energy available. So that brings us to biomass pyramids. Biomass is the total living mass of the organisms and can be referred to the total mass of an individual species, a group of species, or basically all of the organisms in a particular ecosystem. If you calculated the biomass, so exactly how much all the herbivores weighed, all the carnivores weighed, and all the primary producers weighed in a community, the pyramid would look something like this. So our producers would weigh majority. So in this example, the total of our producers weighs 1,000 kilos. Then as we move into our herbivores, they weigh about 1/10 of that, so 100 kilos. Moving into our primary carnivores, again, at only 1/10 of that, so 10 kilos, and our top carnivore on again 1/10. So we're reducing by 1/10 as we move all the way up the pyramid. So obviously these are just numbers to help you sort of understand it a little. A lion is obviously going to weigh more than a kilo, but it gives you that idea that we have this decrease by 10% approximately as we move up the trophic levels. So it's always found that the biomass of plants is more than the biomass of herbivores, which is more than the biomass of carnivores, and so on, which we just saw in our pyramid. So why is this the case? Everything that we do requires energy. We looked at this at the end of the last video on photosynthesis and respiration, that when we grow, we reproduce, we digest our food, all of those things require energy that we get from cellular respiration. So we use glucose that we take in from our food, plus oxygen that we take in from the air. We produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. Now, as you breathe out, you excrete some carbon dioxide gas, as well as small amounts of water vapor. So those molecules and the mass of those molecules is lost, so it's no longer available. Also, as you use the energy from the ATP molecules, that energy is converted to heat and dissipates into the surroundings. Now, just like we can't create molecules in a chemical reaction, they need to be rearranged, we can't create energy. So if that energy is transferred from chemical energy to heat energy, we can no longer use it. So it can't be reused by living things. So in an ecosystem, about 90% of the food or energy taken in at any trophic level is lost either as wastes or as heat. This means only about 10% of the biomass and energy of any trophic level is available to be eaten by the next level of organisms. And as we saw in the previous slide, this results in that beautiful biomass pyramid shape. So here we have a pyramid of biomass and energy. So we have our trophic levels up the side here, starting with our first trophic level, which is our producers. And we can see that we have the largest amount of producers. Now, 90% of the biomass and the energy is lost to the environment, and 10% therefore is available to our herbivores. Our herbivores then lose 90% of their biomass and energy, so only 10% of that is left for our carnivores. And as we move on, we can obviously see that eventually there's going to be pretty much nothing left. So for the food chain, grass is eaten by a kangaroo, which is eaten by a dingo. If there was, say, 100,000 kilograms of grass, then this could not support more than about 10,000 kilograms of kangaroos and only about 1,000 kilograms of dingoes. So that relates back to that previous biomass pyramid, but it puts it into a little bit more of a realistic numbers. So the approximate population numbers would be about 5 million grass plants, feed about 400 kangaroos, which only feeds about 50 dingoes. Okay, so we end up with that really decreasing number of biomass, so the weight of the individual organisms, the energy, as well as the individual numbers of individual species. So we're just quickly going to have a look at that other dot point that was there. Describe the role of decomposers in ecosystems. So decomposers, all along the food chain, organic wastes are produced. So this leftover waste material is food for a very important group of organisms called our decomposers. So decomposers include organisms such as bacteria up the top here and fungi, so our mushrooms and toadstools. These organisms feed on the scraps and wastes, and in doing so cause waste to decay and be broken down into simple chemicals, such as carbon dioxide, which we can use, or the plants can use, for photosynthesis, and nitrate and phosphate ions, which get absorbed into the soil and can be used for plants for optimal growth. So this process is essential to the recycling of chemicals in an ecosystem. Not only do decomposers get rid of all the yucky stuff and clean up the environment, but they ensure that the vital chemicals are recycled into the air or soil for reuse by the plants. So if we didn't have decomposers, we'd be surrounded by dead bodies, dead material everywhere. So even though they're a little bit gross, they do a really important job of getting rid of all of that stuff, but also providing those vital nutrients and chemicals. So the dot point that we'll be looking at in class is gather information from first-hand and secondary sources to construct food chains and food webs to illustrate the relationship between member species in an ecosystem. Okay, so all those things that we've just talked about in the video, we're going to be putting into practice in class. And that brings us to the end. So thank you.